The day my husband's mother called me a financial burden to my face, I was standing in my own kitchen, holding a spatula, making dinner for all of them. She didn't lower her voice. She wasn't embarrassed. She just said it the way someone might comment on the weather. Flat, certain, like she had been thinking it for years and had finally decided the moment was right to let it out. "You've always been a drain on this family," she said. "And frankly, I think it's time we talked about you finding your own place." My husband was sitting at the island. He said nothing. I turned back to the stove. I'd like to tell you that I had some great response ready, that I said something cutting and brilliant and walked out with my head high. But the truth is, I finished making dinner. I set the table. I poured water into everyone's glasses, including hers, and when she sat down and helped herself to the meal I had cooked, I let her, because I had been letting her for a very long time and old habits don't break cleanly. What nobody in that room understood, what I had never once brought up, not during a fight, not during a holiday dinner, not during any of the dozen small humiliations that had accumulated over 6 years of marriage, was that the house we were all sitting in was mine, not my husband's, not his mother's. Mine. My name was on the title. My savings had covered the down payment. My income had carried the mortgage through 14 months when my husband's contracting business had flatlined, and he hadn't wanted his mother to know how bad things had gotten. I hadn't told anyone. I had just paid. And I had kept quiet for so long that they had mistaken my silence for weakness. That was, I think, the most expensive misunderstanding they ever made. My name is Vivienne. No, wait, that's not right. I've been telling this story so many times lately that I catch myself reaching for a different version of myself, something cleaner and more composed. Let me start over. My name is Joelle. No, that's not right either. The names in this story matter less than what happened. What matters is that I was 33 years old. I was a licensed mortgage broker working at a mid-size firm in Calgary, and I had spent 6 years married to a man I genuinely loved, who had a mother I had learned to navigate the way you learn to navigate a patch of ice. Carefully. With your weight balanced, never assuming you were through it just because you hadn't fallen yet. His name isn't important for these purposes. I'll call him my husband. His mother I'll call my mother-in-law, because that's what she was, in every technical and emotional sense of the word. My mother-in-law had moved to Calgary from Kelowna 3 years into our marriage, following a falling out with my husband's older brother that nobody would explain to me in full. She arrived with 2 suitcases, a small dog, and an operating assumption that she would be living with us indefinitely. My husband had agreed to this before telling me. I found out when her things appeared in the spare bedroom. I want to be fair about who she was, because I think fairness matters even when it's difficult. She wasn't a cruel person in the way that people are cruel when they enjoy it. She was the kind of person who had spent so long being the emotional center of her family that she had never developed any real awareness of where she ended and other people began. Her needs were always the most urgent needs in the room. Her feelings were always the feelings that organized the conversation. And because my husband had grown up inside that dynamic, he didn't see it the way I did. To him, it was just how she was. To me, it was something I had to account for in every interaction, the way you account for a strong current when you're trying to swim in a straight line. I tried, in the beginning. I really did. I learned which topics to avoid. I learned that she didn't like to be corrected in front of other people, even gently, even about minor things. I learned that she had opinions about how I loaded the dishwasher, how I folded towels, how I arranged things on the kitchen counter, and that these opinions were not offered as suggestions. I learned to schedule calls with my own mother when my mother-in-law wasn't home because the sound of me laughing with someone else in another room seemed to bother her in a way she couldn't name, but reliably expressed afterward by going very quiet and then making small pointed comments about the state of the bathroom, or the fact that the recycling hadn't been taken out. I learned. I adapted. I kept going. What I didn't do was tell her whose house she was living in. Here's the part I need to explain carefully, because it's the part that matters most and it's also the part that sounds the most unlikely. When my husband and I bought the house in 2018, we had been married for 2 years. I had been working in mortgage brokerage for 4 years by then, and I understood exactly what we were buying, what it would cost, and what it would require. My husband was making decent money from his contracting work, but it wasn't steady in the way that satisfies lenders. My income was the one that qualified us. My credit history was the one that got us the rate we got. We agreed verbally, between ourselves, that it would go on in both our names. And then, 2 weeks before closing, his business partner called in a loan my husband had guaranteed without telling me. $38,000 due within 60 days. My husband came to me at 10 o'clock at night with a piece of paper and the look of a man who had been carrying something he didn't know how to put down. I didn't scream at him. I was angry. Quietly, deeply angry in the way you get when you realize that someone you trust has been managing a secret for months and only brought you in when there was no other option. But I didn't scream, because screaming doesn't solve a cash flow problem. We had options. I ran through them. The cleanest one, the one that protected both of us the most going forward, was to restructure the purchase so the property went on in my name only. We would sort out the legal arrangements between us later. Right now, the priority was closing on the house without the lender seeing the liability on his file. He agreed. We signed. The house went into my name. We never got around to adding him back on. Not because I was trying to retain power or keep him out. I want to be clear about that. But because life moved quickly and the paperwork felt like something we could always do next month. And next month kept becoming the month after. He knew the title was in my name. He had signed documents that reflected that. It wasn't a secret between us. It was only a secret from his mother. And then, the year his contracting business struggled. A bad winter, 2 projects that fell through, a client who disputed invoices for 6 months. I covered the mortgage alone. 14 months of payments. I didn't announce this. I didn't make him feel small about it. I transferred the money from my account. The payments went through and we kept going. He paid me back what he could when things picked up. His mother never knew any of this. She lived in our house with her small dog, under the assumption that it was her son's house in some fundamental inherited sense, as if ownership followed masculinity by default, as if the logistics of a property were something that happened invisibly behind a stage she had simply walked onto. So when she told me on a Tuesday night in November that I was a financial drain and that it was time I found my own place, she was doing it in a house that was legally mine, while eating food I had bought, while the mortgage statement for the month sat unopened on the counter, addressed to me by name. My husband looked at his plate. That was its own kind of answer. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the dark and I made a decision, not dramatically, not with the feeling of crossing some great threshold, but in the quiet way you make decisions when you are very tired and have finally run out of reasons to keep deferring. I decided that I was done managing. I was done minimizing and adapting and scheduling my phone calls around someone else's feelings. The decision didn't announce itself in words. It was more like something I had been carrying for a long time finally settling into a different position in my body. One I could maintain instead of one that kept wearing me out. I called my sister the next morning. She's 4 years older than me, and she has never once in her life pretended that something was fine when it wasn't, which is a quality I have always admired and occasionally found exhausting. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You know you don't have to live like this, right?" I said I knew. She said, "Do you actually know, or are you saying you know the way you've been saying it for 3 years?" I told her I actually knew this time. She came over that Saturday. My mother-in-law was at a church function she attended most Saturdays, a women's group that ran from 10 in the morning until early afternoon. My husband was on a job site. My sister sat across from me at the kitchen table with a coffee, and she said, very directly, "What do you want to happen?" I thought about it seriously. Not about what was fair, not about what would feel satisfying in the moment, but about what I actually wanted the next year of my life to look like. I didn't want to evict my mother-in-law. I want to say that clearly. Whatever she had said, whatever the accumulated weight of those years felt like, she was an elderly woman who had come here in difficult circumstances, and I was not interested in causing harm. What I wanted was for the terms to change. I wanted to stop living in my own house as though I were a guest who had somehow overstayed her welcome. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted honesty. I wanted my husband to stop going quiet every time his mother said something that required a response. I spent the next 2 weeks gathering documents. This sounds more ominous than it was. I'm a mortgage broker. I already knew exactly where everything was. Title certificate, mortgage statements, insurance documents in my name, records of the payments I had made during the 14 months my husband's business had struggled. Everything organized in a folder that I kept in my desk at work. I wasn't building a case. I was building clarity. The conversation I had been waiting for happened on a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after the dinner where she had said what she said. My mother-in-law had apparently been waiting too, because she had clearly been gathering her own momentum and had decided to bring the subject up again, this time with my husband present in a way that felt deliberate, as if having him in the room would change the weight of what she was saying. "I've been thinking," she said after dinner while I was clearing the table, "about the arrangement here. I think it would be better for everyone if we could think about transitioning the spare room. Maybe turning it into something the children could use when the time comes." She said it the way she said most things that were actually about control. Wrapped in practical language, delivered with a tone of gentle reasonableness. The "when the time comes" was a reference to grandchildren. The spare room was her room. What she was describing, without saying it directly, was that she intended to remain here permanently and was already planning the reallocation of space around her continued presence. I set down the plates I was holding. I sat down at the table. My husband was looking at his coffee cup. "I'd like to talk about the house," I said. My mother-in-law nodded with the kind of measured patience that meant she thought she was about to have a conversation she already understood. "I want to make sure we're all working with the same information," I said. I turned to my husband. "Do you want to tell her, or would you like me to?" He looked up. Something shifted in his face. He had known this moment was possible. Not necessarily inevitable, but possible. And he had been living in the space between possibility and arrival for long enough that seeing it finally happen seemed to surprise him anyway. "Tell me what," my mother-in-law said. My husband said nothing, so I told her. I told her that the house we were sitting in was registered in my name, that it had been in my name since we purchased it, that the down payment had come from savings I had built before we married, that the mortgage was in my name, paid from my income, and that for 14 months when my husband's business had been struggling, I had covered every payment myself. She stared at me. "That's not possible," she said. "I have the documents if you'd like to see them," I said. She looked at my husband. He met her eyes for a moment and then looked at the table. "You knew," she said. "Mom." His voice was careful. "It's not, it's both of ours. We're married." "Legally," I said quietly. "The property is in my name. That's what the title says. That's what the mortgage says. That's what my tax records would say. I'm not disputing that we're married. I'm just making sure we all know what we're actually talking about when we talk about this house." The silence that followed was the longest I had experienced in that kitchen, and that kitchen had seen some silences. My mother-in-law looked smaller, somehow, than she had looked a few minutes ago. Not diminished in a way I wanted. I wasn't looking for that. Just smaller in the specific way that happens when someone's assumptions about a room they're sitting in turn out to be wrong. She said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "I'm not saying this to embarrass anyone. I'm saying it because I think it matters that we all understand how things actually are, instead of how we've been assuming they are." My husband said, "Mel." I looked at him. He said, "I should have said something sooner." I told him he should have. What happened in the following days was not a clean resolution. I want to be honest about that, because I think the stories that wrap up too neatly do a disservice to anyone who is living through something genuinely complicated. There were hard conversations. My mother-in-law went quiet for 2 days in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Less pointed, more retreated, as if she were processing something privately that she wasn't ready to bring into the open. My husband and I talked, late at night, with the kind of honesty we had been circling around for longer than either of us wanted to admit. He told me he had been afraid that his mother would feel like a burden if she knew the full picture. I told him that protecting her feelings at the expense of mine had cost something real between us, and that I needed him to understand that. He said he understood. I told him that understanding and acting were not the same thing, and that I needed to see the acting. My sister called to check in. I told her we were managing. On the 3rd day, my mother-in-law came to find me while my husband was out. She knocked on the door of the home office, which she had never done before. She had always walked in, and she waited until I said, "Come in." She sat across from me in the chair I keep there for client meetings. She said she had been thinking. She said that she owed me an apology for what she'd said at dinner. She said she understood now that she had been operating under assumptions about this house that were not accurate, and that the things she had said, the word she had used, drain, and the suggestion that I should leave, she would not have said them if she had known. I didn't say that they still shouldn't have been said, regardless of what she knew. Maybe I should have. But what I said was that I appreciated her telling me, and that I wanted us to find a way to live here that was honest and worked for everyone. She nodded slowly. She asked what I needed. I told her. I needed her to understand that decisions about this house, who was welcome here, what changes were made, how the space was used, were mine to make, and that I would always consult my husband, but I would not be overruled in my own home. I told her that she was welcome to stay genuinely, but that I needed her to treat me as someone who had standing here, not as someone who was here on sufferance. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your husband is lucky." I didn't know entirely how to take that, so I just thanked her. My husband and I went to see a family law lawyer the following month. Not because we were in any kind of crisis, but because I wanted our arrangements to be formalized in a way that reflected what was actually true. We had a cohabitation agreement drawn up, which in Alberta, in a marriage context, functions a bit like a postnuptial agreement that acknowledged my sole ownership of the property and set out clear terms for what would happen if our circumstances changed. My husband signed it without argument. He told me afterward that he should have done something like this years ago and that he was sorry he hadn't. I believed him. My mother-in-law has been here for another 8 months since that Saturday conversation. Things are different, and different is not the same as easy, but it's better. She knocks now. She doesn't offer opinions about the kitchen unless I ask. She still has opinions about the kitchen, that hasn't changed, but she keeps them to herself more than she used to, which I consider a reasonable equilibrium. There are still hard days. I'm not going to pretend we arrived at some perfect place where everything resolved into warmth and understanding, because that's not how people work, and it's not how families work, and it's especially not how families-in-law work. But I no longer go to bed at night feeling like a guest in my own house. I no longer calibrate my movements around someone else's comfort. I sit at the kitchen table in the morning with my coffee, and I let it go warm while I look out the window at the yard, and for the first time in 6 years, the chair I'm sitting in feels like mine because I know, not just legally, but in the way that settles in your chest, that it is. The thing I want to say, if I'm being honest, is this. I stayed quiet for a long time because I thought silence was the kindest option. I thought keeping the peace was the same as maintaining the relationship. I thought absorbing the difficult parts of living with someone who couldn't see past her own assumptions was a form of love, extended toward my husband if not toward her. What I've learned is that silence can be generous, but it can also be a way of avoiding the truth for so long, that the truth eventually has to announce itself in ways that are more disruptive than if you just said it clearly earlier. I didn't set out to have power in that moment. I didn't engineer a situation where I could finally say, actually, this is mine. I had just lived honestly. I had paid what needed to be paid. I had signed what needed to be signed. I had kept the records because keeping records is part of my job and my training and my way of being in the world. The power was just what remained after the assumptions cleared away. It wasn't triumph. I want to say that again because I think it matters. What it was accurate. And accurate after so many years of being told a different story about my own worth, about what I contributed and whether it mattered and whether I was here by right or by tolerance. Accurate felt enormous. Accurate felt like something solid under my feet on a surface I had been navigating carefully for a very long time. I repainted the home office last spring. It's a color my mother-in-law once described as too dark. I chose it anyway. And every time I sit in there across from a client, or across from my own paperwork, or just across from myself and the window and the quiet of a weekday afternoon, I think about what it means to own a thing. Not just on paper, but in the way you carry yourself in a space you know is yours. It means you stop apologizing for being there. It means you stop making yourself smaller to fit a shape someone else decided you should be. It means that one Tuesday night in November, when someone tells you that you are a burden in a house that legally, officially, and entirely belongs to you, you do not argue. You do not perform outrage. You go back to the stove, and you finish making dinner, and you wait, with the patience of someone who has always known which cards they're holding, for the moment when it becomes necessary to lay them down.